6 men had Vanessa Whitmore trapped against the black door of her own limousine when a maintenance worker stepped out of the rain. Grant Holloway wore a faded jacket, carried a broken toolbox, and looked like the last man anyone should fear. Vanessa shouted for him to run. He didn't. 90 seconds later, 6 men were staring at him in stunned silence. Then their leader noticed the jagged scar beneath Grant's collar. His face lost all color. He slowly stepped backward and whispered one name Grant had buried 11 years ago: North Star. Vanessa froze because every man suddenly lowered his head. Stay until the end, because the name North Star reveals why Grant disappeared and who Vanessa unknowingly trusted for 12 years. Chicago sat under a cold rain at 11:47 at night when Vanessa Whitmore stepped out of a private meeting at the Halston Crown Hotel, her mind still turning over numbers from a room full of investors who wanted answers. Wasn't ready to give. She walked fast toward her black limousine heels, striking wet pavement coat pulled tight against the wind, and the first thing that felt wrong wasn't the 6 men waiting near the car. It was the empty driver's seat. Her phone showed no signal. The car doors stayed locked, no matter how many times she pressed the key fob, and one by one 6 shapes stepped out of the shadows around the alley behind the hotel. None of them carried a weapon. None of them shouted. It was their calm that frightened her most, the sense that they had done this before and knew exactly how it would end. The one who stepped forward first called himself nothing, but his eyes carried the weight of command, and later, she would learn his name was Wade Mercer. Wade demanded a data drive, the very one Vanessa had just received inside that closed-door meeting upstairs. She denied having it out of instinct more than strategy, but Wade recited the floor. She'd just left the room number, even the exact minute she'd stepped into the elevator, and in that instant, Vanessa understood something far worse than a robbery. Someone inside her own company was tracking her in real time down to the second. When one of the men moved to block her path completely, Vanessa did the only thing left to her and screamed into the empty street, hoping anyone would hear. At the far end of the alley, a man in a worn maintenance jacket had just finished repairing a failing heating unit for the hotel, a cracked toolbox hanging from one hand, rain soaking through the collar of his coat. He heard her voice. He stopped walking, looked at the 6 men, then looked at her, and set the toolbox down on the wet ground, with a gentleness that seemed strange for the moment, as if nothing about this required urgency. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't drop into a fighting stance. There was no posture of a man preparing for violence, only a quiet level question directed at Vanessa herself. "Do you know these men, ma'am?" She said no. He nodded once and told her to step behind him, and the 6 men actually laughed because nothing about this stranger looked like a threat. Vanessa, furious and certain he didn't understand the danger, ordered him to leave before he got hurt. But Grant Holloway didn't move an inch. When the nearest man shoved his shoulder, Grant simply wasn't there anymore, as though he'd known the shove was coming 3 full seconds before it landed. A second man lunged and found himself carried by his own momentum straight into the side of the limousine. A third man's wrist was locked before he even registered being touched. A fourth froze entirely, deciding in that instant that whatever this man was, it wasn't worth finding out the hard way. In the space of 90 seconds, all 6 men had stopped, not because they were badly hurt, but because none of them wanted to test him a second time. Vanessa realized, watching from behind him, that this was not the muscle memory of a hotel maintenance worker. It was something trained, something economical, something that had clearly been used before in circumstances far worse than a wet alley in Chicago. Wade stared at Grant with the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. Grant turned to check on Vanessa, and as he turned, his collar shifted just enough to reveal a long, jagged scar running from beneath his left ear down toward his collarbone. Wade's eyes locked onto it. The confidence drained out of his face in a single breath, and he stepped back as though the ground itself had tilted beneath him. "Impossible," he said, so quietly it barely reached the others. Grant reached up and pulled his collar closed, but it was already too late. Wade whispered a single word, more question than statement, and it landed in the alley like a gunshot. "North Star." Grant went completely still. Vanessa looked from Wade to Grant, and back again, utterly lost, while the 5 remaining men fell into a silence that had nothing to do with fear of getting hurt, and everything to do with something older, something that predated this rainy street by more than a decade. One of them actually lowered his head the way a soldier lowers his head before a superior officer. Grant's voice came out low and hard when he finally spoke. "That name is gone," he said. Wade shook his head slowly as though the words physically pained him. "Men like you don't disappear, Northstar," he answered. And in that moment, Vanessa realized the man who had just saved her life was more afraid of that single word than he had ever been of the 6 men who'd surrounded her. Sirens rose in the distance, and Wade ordered the remaining 5 to fall back before the police arrived. But what struck Vanessa was that Grant made no move to stop them, no attempt to detain the very men who had just cornered her against her own car. She turned on him immediately, demanding an explanation for why he was letting them simply walk away. Grant bent down, picked up his battered toolbox, and answered with a calm that unsettled her more than anger would have. "They weren't here to hurt you," he said, and Vanessa felt something cold settle in her stomach because 6 strangers had just surrounded her in an alley, yet the man who'd stopped them insisted they were never truly the danger at all. Before Wade disappeared into the dark, he turned back long enough to give Grant a single instruction. 4 words that would come to matter more than anything else said that night. "Check her security team." Grant repeated nothing, asked for no clarification, simply watched Vanessa's face for a reaction she didn't yet understand. On instinct, she called Russell Dane, the head of her corporate security division, a man she'd trusted with her safety for years. Russell answered after 3 rings, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine shock. When he heard what had happened, full of concern, full of questions about her well-being. Grant stood close enough to hear the entire exchange, arms folded, expression unreadable. And once Vanessa ended the call, he asked 2 quiet questions that reshaped the entire night. "Did he ask where you are right now?" "No." "Did he ask if you were hurt?" "No," she admitted, and Grant looked toward the empty street where the limousine still sat. "Then he already knows," Grant said. And Vanessa felt her irritation rise, certain this stranger was accusing the one man she trusted most of something monstrous, based on nothing but a feeling. She demanded to know who exactly he was, and Grant offered only a single word in return. Maintenance. She looked down at his hands, waiting for the tremor that should have followed a violent confrontation, but there was none. No scrapes. No shaking. Nothing but the same steady stillness he'd carried since the moment he set down his toolbox. Vanessa pushed the hotel to pull his employment file, and what came back told her almost nothing useful. 3 years of employment, no complaints. No disciplinary marks, no close friendships noted among staff, no social media presence. Anyone could locate a small rented apartment on the South Side, and a personnel history that thinned into almost nothing before the year 2015. What struck her most was a detail buried in the margins of his file. 3 separate times the hotel had offered him a promotion to department supervisor, and 3 separate times he had turned it down flat. When she asked him why, standing in the lobby with rain still dripping from both their coats, Grant offered a simple explanation that told her everything and nothing at once. "I like being forgettable," he said. Vanessa, unable to help herself, pointed out that tonight he had failed spectacularly at that particular goal. For the first time since the alley, something like a genuine smile crossed his face, faint and brief, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "So did whoever planned this," he replied, and the words hung there between them, heavier than either of them wanted to admit. She offered him money, and he refused it, without hesitation. She offered him a position within her company, and he refused that too, just as fast. Finally, she asked the question that had been circling her mind since the alley, the one word that had made 6 armed men stand down without a fight. Who or what was Northstar? His expression changed instantly, something guarded and old rising behind his eyes. "Don't say that name again," he warned her, but Vanessa Whitmore had built an empire by refusing to be told what she could and couldn't ask, and she stepped closer instead of retreating. 6 men heard that name and stopped cold. She said, "I want to know why." "That's not your decision to make," Grant answered. And she felt the temperature of the conversation drop even further. "It became my decision 11 years ago," he said, and then he simply walked away into the rain, leaving her standing alone in the hotel lobby, with more questions than she'd had before any of this began. She returned to her office that night and called her personal assistant with a single instruction that would set everything else into motion. Find everything on Grant Holloway. 2 hours later, the assistant called back, her voice tight with confusion. "There's nothing," she said. Vanessa pressed further, asking if there was truly nothing before 2015, and the assistant's answer chilled her more than the alley ever had. "No, Miss Whitmore. I mean, there is nothing anywhere." The next morning, Vanessa called an emergency security meeting inside the glass towers of Whitmore Meridian, the logistics and infrastructure empire her father had built, and she now ran. Russell Dane presented the incident as an organized robbery attempt, competent and thorough on the surface, laying out theories about industrial espionage and corporate rivals. Vanessa said nothing about Grant. She said nothing about the word North Star. Instead, she watched Russell's face carefully as he spoke, and when she mentioned that the 6 men had taken nothing of value, not a single file, not a single device, Russell's calm felt slightly too polished, slightly too rehearsed for a man discussing an attack on his own boss. Preston Vale, the company's vice president, and her father's oldest confidant, gently suggested she take a few days away from the office to recover from the trauma of the previous night. "You're exhausted," he told her, his voice warm and paternal. "Let professionals handle this." The phrase, "professionals handle this," echoed strangely in her mind, pulling her thoughts back to Wade's 4 whispered words in the alley. "Check her security team." Quietly, without informing anyone, Vanessa reviewed exactly who had known her schedule the previous evening, and the list was shockingly short. Herself, her assistant, Russell, and Preston. That afternoon, she drove to the address listed in Grant's thin employment file, a modest apartment building far from the glass towers where she spent her days. Grant opened the door before she even knocked, unsurprised by her presence, as though he'd expected this visit the moment he walked away from her the night before. "You took longer than I expected," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment was almost entirely bare. A single table, a worn sofa, a small bookshelf, nothing on the walls, no photographs of family, no diplomas, no evidence that a life had actually been lived inside these rooms. Vanessa asked him directly who North Star was, and Grant continued pouring coffee, as if she hadn't spoken at all. She placed a folder on his table thick with everything her team had managed to compile, which amounted to almost nothing. "Grant Holloway has no high school record," she said. "No college record. No tax history before 2015. Grant glanced at the folder without opening it. "You should stop looking," he told her. She asked why, and his answer was quiet and final. "Because somebody will notice." At that exact moment, the lights in the apartment cut out entirely, and Grant transformed in a way that startled her more than anything else that night. He set his coffee down without a sound, pulled her firmly away from the window, checked his watch, and made no move toward his phone. Instead, he opened a hidden compartment beneath the table, revealing an old radio and a stack of paper maps, no weapons visible anywhere, just tools of a very different kind of preparation. He switched on the radio, listened for perhaps 10 seconds, and then said 2 words that left no room for argument. "We leave." When Vanessa asked why, he simply pointed toward the building across the street, where a 6th-floor window had just drawn its curtains shut. 2 minutes later, the fire alarm in her own apartment building blared through the halls, though she hadn't set foot there in hours, a detail that would only make sense to her later. Grant guided her down a service stairwell and out through a side exit, and as they emerged onto the street, she saw a call coming through from Russell, asking exactly where she was. For the first time in her professional life, Vanessa lied to the man responsible for her personal safety. Grant, watching this unfold, offered a single word of approval. "Good." She snapped at him not to congratulate her for lying to her own security chief. "I wasn't," he replied. "You hesitated 3 seconds before you did it. That's too long." She pressed him again about his past, listing possibilities, one at a time. Military. No reaction. Federal. Still nothing. Intelligence. This time Grant's stride broke just barely, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough, and Vanessa understood she'd finally touched something real. "Go home, Miss Whitmore," he told her, but she reminded him that her home security answered directly to Russell, the very man they now suspected of feeding information to someone dangerous. Grant said nothing for a long moment, absorbing the fact that Vanessa genuinely had nowhere left that could be called safe. Eventually, without another word of explanation, he led her to an old storage warehouse on the outskirts of the city. A place locked and untouched, he told her, for 11 straight years. The warehouse door groaned open onto a mechanical lock, with no camera anywhere in sight, and no connection to any network she could detect. Dust hung thick in the air as Grant stepped inside, and Vanessa followed, stopping, almost immediately at the site covering the far wall. Maps of more than 20 cities were pinned there: London, Berlin, Prague, Rome, Washington, Chicago, each one marked with routes and symbols she couldn't decipher. A table nearby held stacks of handwritten notebooks, the ink faded, but the handwriting careful and precise. Among them she found an old photograph, 7 men, standing in front of a military transport plane, and one face among them was unmistakably Grant, younger, harder around the eyes, but unmistakably him. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single word in fading ink: North Star. Grant took the photograph from her hand, almost before she'd finished reading it, his grip tighter than necessary. She asked if those men had been his team. No, he answered simply. Then what were they? She pressed, and Grant looked down at the photograph with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something closer to grief than caution. They were the people I was supposed to bring home, he said, and the room seemed to shift around them. For the first time, Grant let a piece of his real story surface. 13 years earlier, he told her he had not been Grant Holloway at all, not in any way the world currently understood that name. He had been something far more specific, a specialist in risk assessment and personnel extraction, the person sent into collapsing situations across dangerous corners of the world to find the single path that would bring people out, alive. He wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense, and he wasn't hired muscle either. His job was to look at a system falling apart and see the one route through it that everyone else missed, and for 3 years he did exactly that again and again without losing a single person under his protection. His colleagues had given him the name North Star, because no matter how dark or chaotic the situation became, Grant never lost direction, and he never left anyone behind. He told Vanessa he had always hated the name because it made people believe he was infallible, and infallible men make the most dangerous mistakes of all. Then came the final mission, the one that ended everything, the one whose weight he had carried alone for 11 years, without ever putting it into words for another living person, until this moment, standing in a dusty warehouse with a stranger who had somehow become impossible to shake. Vanessa asked about the scar along his neck, and he offered no answer at first. She asked why he had vanished, so completely erasing every trace of the man he used to be, and this time Grant answered with 6 simple words that carried the weight of everything else. Because 6 people trusted my route, he said. Vanessa looked again at the photograph, counting the faces. 7 men stood in that image, and Grant was the 7th. Understanding began to dawn on her slowly, painfully. Did they die? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Grant shook his head. No, he said. Vanessa's relief lasted only a moment before his next words undid it entirely. That's worse, he told her, and then he began to explain. The mission, he said, had been betrayed from within. Someone inside the network had leaked the secret evacuation route to the people they were trying to escape, and the 6 men under his protection were captured while Grant, separated from the group by circumstance, made his way back alone to retrieve them. It took 36 brutal hours, but he brought every single one of them out alive, dragging them one by one through a nightmare that never should have happened in the first place. But the informant, the person who had betrayed the route and put 6 lives in mortal danger, was never identified, never caught, never brought to any kind of justice. Grant understood in the aftermath that whoever had done this remained embedded somewhere inside that same network, watching, waiting, capable of doing it again to anyone connected to him. So he vanished. He rebuilt an entire life from nothing, changing cities, repeatedly working as a mechanic, a warehouse hand, and eventually a hotel maintenance manager, always choosing work that let him disappear into the background of other people's lives. Vanessa connected the pieces slowly. Wade was one of the 6, she said, and Grant confirmed it with a single nod. Suddenly she understood why Wade had lowered his head in that alley. Why the fear on his face hadn't truly been fear at all. It was something closer to reverence, the quiet respect of a man who owed his life to someone who had chosen to turn back for him, when turning back cost everything. Grant spread a map of Chicago across the table, laying Vanessa's own recent schedule beside it, alongside notes on data breaches, shipping contracts, and international routes belonging to Whitmore Meridian. He looked up at her with an expression that told her the worst was still ahead. "Your company isn't being attacked," he said. Confused, she asked what exactly was happening then, and Grant pointed toward the Whitmore Meridian symbol marked across 6 different cities on his old maps. "Someone has been using your company for 12 years, he told her. The color drained from Vanessa's face as the implication settled in. Whitmore Meridian's international expansion, the very growth that had made the company a global powerhouse, had been engineered primarily by one man, Preston Vale. Vanessa demanded proof before she would accuse anyone, especially not a man who had stood beside her through her father's death and every difficult year that followed. Grant refused to name Preston as guilty, based purely on suspicion, insisting instead on telling her the entire truth of who he had once been, so that she would understand exactly what kind of enemy they might be facing. 14 years earlier, he explained, he had been the youngest operative ever selected for a highly specialized crisis consulting unit, a role built not around brute strength or marksmanship, but around something rarer, the ability to read patterns other people couldn't see. He could study a traffic map and identify the one route already under surveillance. He could listen to a conversation and detect exactly which piece of information had been deliberately planted. He could watch 6 people in a room and know almost instantly who among them was lying. Over 3 years, Grant participated in 27 separate evacuation and protection operations, and in every single one, without exception, he brought his people home alive. 27 times. Not one loss. Within a very small, very insular community of specialists, the name North Star became something close to legend, and Grant despised every bit of that reputation because it convinced people he was incapable of failure. And men convinced of their own infallibility make catastrophic mistakes. The final operation took place in Europe with Wade Mercer, serving as the field team leader on the ground. Grant had designed 3 separate extraction routes for the mission code named Alpha, Gray, and North, and only 7 people in the entire operation knew the details of that final most secure route. Despite every precaution, the opposition was waiting for them anyway. Grant took a serious wound to the neck during the kidnap buyers, the injury that would leave the scar. Wade recognized instantly, 11 years later, sustained, while breaking through the shattered window of an overturned vehicle to reach the men. Trapped inside, he had a clear opportunity to retreat to safety and chose not to take it. Instead, he turned back into the danger, and across 36 agonizing hours, he pulled every one of the 6 men out alive one at a time, with Wade being the very last to be rescued. By the time Wade regained full consciousness, Grant Holloway, or whoever he had been before that name, had already vanished completely, leaving no trace and no explanation behind him. When Vanessa asked why he had disappeared so thoroughly rather than staying to help hunt down whoever had betrayed the mission, Grant explained that the traitor knew his real identity, and staying close to anyone connected to him would only place those people in further danger. Cutting every tie was the only way to protect what remained of the people he cared about. For 11 years, he lived as an ordinary man moving through cities and jobs that asked nothing of him, deliberately choosing invisibility over the legend that had once defined him. Vanessa, studying his face in the dim warehouse light, asked one more question that seemed to catch him off guard entirely. She asked why he had once described himself in passing as a single father, when nothing in his current life suggested any children at all. Grant was quiet for a long moment before answering. That part of his life, he told her, carefully belonged to a personal chapter. He had no intention of turning into another tool for this investigation, and he asked her plainly not to dig further into that particular corner of his past. Vanessa respected the boundary without pushing, sensing this was not a door meant to be opened tonight, or perhaps ever in the context of what they were now facing together. Grant redirected them both back to the matter at hand, laying out everything he'd gathered on Preston Vale. Preston had worked alongside Vanessa's father for 12 years, a span of time that aligned precisely with the moment Grant's old network had first been betrayed from within. Whitmore Meridian, through Preston's guidance, had steadily gained access to ports, warehouses, cargo aircraft, and international shipping corridors across the globe, building exactly the kind of infrastructure a person could use to quietly move people, money, or information without drawing attention. Vanessa still resisted the idea, unable to reconcile the man who had comforted her the night her father died with the picture Grant was painting. Preston had helped secure her position as chief executive. Preston had stood beside her through every difficult transition since. That's exactly why betrayal like this works, Grant told her gently. She asked if he meant that people simply trusted the wrong person too easily. No, Grant answered. It's because the wrong person earns the right to be trusted in the first place. Before either of them could say anything more, Vanessa's phone buzzed with a message from Preston himself, one that made her blood run cold. He already knew she was with Grant Holloway. Vanessa's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but Grant stopped her, reasoning that if Preston had controlled this network for as long as they suspected, there was no way to know how many people inside law enforcement, inside Whitmore, Meridian itself, might already be compromised. Instead, Vanessa proposed something Grant hadn't expected, a plan of her own. And for the first time, he realized she wasn't simply a woman who needed constant protection. She was the head of a global company for a reason. And that reason had nothing to do with luck. Whitmore Meridian was preparing to finalize a $48 million infrastructure contract, and Vanessa suggested using it as bait. She had a falsified document, created one containing a fabricated secret shipping route and fake access codes with only 3 copies ever produced. 1 copy went to Russell. 1 copy went to Preston. 1 copy she kept herself, and each version carried a tiny, deliberate discrepancy that Grant designed specifically to trace exactly which copy leaked and to whom. Vanessa called an emergency board meeting, and Grant attended, posing as an outside maintenance contractor, blending seamlessly into the background the way he had for 11 years. Preston looked at him across the room and showed absolutely no visible reaction. But Grant noticed one thing, a fraction of a second, where Preston's fingers paused on the pen in his hand. It lasted no longer than half a second, but Grant had spent a lifetime reading exactly these kinds of details, and he understood immediately. Preston recognized him. During the meeting, Vanessa deliberately brought up the incident from 2 nights earlier, watching closely as Preston expressed carefully measured concern, and Russell recommended increasing her personal security detail. Grant observed both men without a word. Afterward, as the meeting broke up, Preston walked past Grant and paused. "Have we met?" he asked, his tone light and pleasant. "I fix things people tend to ignore," Grant answered. Preston smiled thinly. "A useful profession," he said. "Until the ignored thing brings the whole building down," Grant replied, and for a brief moment the 2 men simply looked at each other, a silent confrontation neither one needed to explain aloud. That same night, one of Whitmore Meridian's servers was accessed without authorization, and the falsified document Vanessa had planted was taken. Grant examined the trace markers immediately and confirmed what the discrepancies revealed. Vanessa asked if it had been Russell. Grant shook his head. "Preston," he said. Vanessa sat in stunned silence, absorbing the fact that a man she'd trusted for 12 years had just betrayed her in the most concrete way possible. But the next detail Grant uncovered complicated everything further. The stolen document hadn't been transmitted anywhere overseas, as they'd expected. It had been sent to an address right there in Chicago, a warehouse Grant recognized instantly, because it was the very site his old North Star team had used for operations more than a decade earlier. Vanessa asked if Preston was inviting Grant back into that world deliberately. "No," Grant answered, staring at the screen. "He's finishing what he started." Grant urged Vanessa to leave Chicago entirely and let him handle what came next alone. But she refused outright. This was her company, she reminded him, built and named after her father, representing 12 years of her own life poured into every decision that shaped it. "Pride gets people trapped," Grant warned her coldly. "So does guilt," she shot back, and the words struck something deep in him because he had spent 11 years running not from danger but from exactly that kind of guilt. He fell silent, absorbing the accusation, and Vanessa pressed further, asking how many more years he had planned to keep punishing himself for something that had happened so long ago. Before Grant could answer, the warehouse door swung open, and 6 men stepped inside, Wade Mercer, leading them the very same 6 from the alley, on the night this all began. Vanessa instinctively stepped back, but Grant held his ground. Wade placed a folder on the table between them, and finally the truth came out in full. On the night Vanessa had been cornered, Wade explained they had never intended to hurt her at all. Their goal had simply been to secure the data drive before Preston's people could get to it first. using aggressive tactics that admittedly went too far in their execution. Wade and the 5 men beside him were in fact the same 6 people Grant had once pulled from captivity during that final mission overseas, and they had spent the past 11 years quietly hunting the person who had betrayed them all those years ago. 3 weeks earlier, their search had finally produced a name: Preston Vale. But they lacked evidence strong enough to move against a man of his standing and influence. Wade apologized to Vanessa directly, though she wasn't quick to forgive him, pointing out that their actions had genuinely convinced her she was under real attack. Wade accepted the criticism without argument. Grant asked why they hadn't simply reached out to him directly, instead of orchestrating something so dangerous. Wade laughed, though there was little humor in it. "We tried," he said. They had spent 11 years searching for Northstar, and Grant, as it turned out, had simply become too skilled at disappearing for even his own former team to find him. "You taught us how to vanish," Wade said. "Then you vanished better than any of us ever could." A brief fragile lightness passed between them, cutting through the tension for just a moment, before Wade handed Grant a second photograph. Preston Vale, younger by 11 years, standing near the exact location where Northstar's final mission had collapsed overseas. Grant studied the image, and the old scar along his neck seemed to ache with the memory it stirred. "What do we do?" Northstar, Wade asked. "Don't call me that," Grant answered, immediately sharp and automatic. Wade looked at the 5 men beside him, then back at Grant. "We've been lost for 11 years, he said quietly, spreading a Chicago street map across the table in front of him. "We need our Northstar." Grant turned to Vanessa, who made no plea, offered no desperate appeal, only a simple statement delivered with the same steadiness he'd come to recognize in her. "You saved 6 men once," she said, placing the Whitmore Meridian files down beside the map. "Help me save 30,000 employees from the man who has been using my company against them." Grant closed his eyes for a long moment, weighing 11 years of running against everything standing in front of him now. Then he opened them, pulled the map toward himself, and spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Lock the doors," he said. Wade smiled for the first time since walking into the warehouse. Northstar had returned. By morning, Grant had discovered something that reshaped their entire strategy. Preston wasn't preparing to flee the city at all. He was preparing to walk directly into the headquarters of Whitmore Meridian the following day, as though he had nothing at all to fear. The next morning found Vanessa on the 61st floor of her own headquarters, walking into an emergency board meeting, with nothing but her own resolve to carry her through it. Preston appeared entirely composed, greeting her warmly, clearly, believing she still hadn't uncovered the full truth of what he'd done. Vanessa opened the meeting by announcing a serious vulnerability discovered within the company's logistics systems, and Preston calmly deflected the accusation, framing it as nothing more than a routine technical error. Russell backed him up without hesitation, and slowly the board began to look at Vanessa, with the kind of skeptical concern reserved for someone whose judgment was in question. Preston seized the moment, gently suggesting the board temporarily suspend her executive authority, citing her fragile psychological state following the recent incident. Vanessa glanced around the room and understood immediately that this had never been about physical harm. It was about dismantling her credibility entirely, then legally seizing control of everything her father had built. A vote to suspend her was moments away when the door to the boardroom opened, and Grant walked in still dressed in his maintenance uniform, exactly as he had been the very first night. Preston looked at him and dismissed him instantly. "Security," he said, and Russell began to rise from his chair. Grant set a battered toolbox down on the conference table. The same gesture from the alley on that first night. "That's the actual problem in this room," he said calmly. Vanessa asked for the main screen to be activated, and Wade's team working with him from outside had assembled a full data model detailing 12 years of manipulated shipping routes, 43 altered transportation corridors, 19 shell companies, layers of intermediary accounts and transport orders, bearing signatures traced directly back to Preston's division. Preston remained calm throughout, arguing that digital data could easily be fabricated or manipulated to frame an innocent man. Grant agreed with him completely. "That's exactly why I didn't bring digital data at all," he said, and opened the toolbox sitting on the table. Inside were paper files, original documents, signed contracts, shipping logs predating the company's full transition to digital record-keeping. Preston's composure cracked for the first time since the meeting began. Grant explained calmly that a man intelligent enough to erase 12 years of electronic evidence had spent all that effort scrubbing digital footprints, while completely overlooking the physical archives still maintained by Whitmore, Meridian's older record storage division, a company Vanessa herself had quietly acquired 6 years earlier, a fact Preston had never known. Russell rose abruptly and headed for the door, only to find Wade waiting just outside it. Preston turned toward Grant and delivered a sentence that silenced the entire room instantly. "You should have died 11 years ago, North Star," he said. Vanessa turned to the board with quiet precision. "Thank you, Preston," she said, because he had just confirmed in front of every board member present that he knew the identity of a man whose old code name had never once been spoken publicly by anyone in that room. Cornered on every side, Preston still refused to collapse entirely. He turned to Grant with a final card left to play. "Tell them why you really disappeared," he said. Grant said nothing at first, and Preston revealed something that struck harder than any evidence gathered so far. Grant, he claimed, had spent 11 years secretly doubting himself, believing that during that final mission he had personally changed the extraction route at the last possible moment, a decision only he had known about, and that this single choice was the true reason 6 men had ended up captured. For 11 long years, Grant had silently wondered whether his own judgment, not betrayal, had caused the disaster that reshaped every life connected to that mission. Preston smiled coldly. "I never betrayed your final route," he said. Grant stared at him. "I made you change it." Preston continued, and the room went utterly still. Preston had planted false intelligence directly into the operational system, knowing Grant would read the pattern, recognize the apparent danger, and reroute the extraction himself exactly as Grant's training compelled him to do. Preston hadn't defeated North Star through force or superior strength. He had used Grant's own extraordinary gift against him, turning the very instinct that made him legendary into the mechanism of his downfall. Grant stood frozen. 11 years of guilt and self-punishment collapsing beneath a single sentence. All of it built atop a carefully constructed lie. Wade stepped into the room at that moment, having heard enough through the open door. "You came back," he said simply. Grant looked at him, and Wade nodded toward the old scar visible above his collar. "You had every reason in the world to walk away and never look back," Wade said. "But you came back for all 6 of us anyway." The 5 other men filed in behind Wade, standing tall now, not bowing their heads out of fear the way they had that first night in the rain, but standing as equals beside someone they had waited 11 years to properly thank. "North Star wasn't the man who chose the wrong road," Wade said. "North Star was the man who turned around when everyone else would have kept running." Vanessa watched Grant, closely recognizing this, as the moment he finally faced the truth he'd carried alone for over a decade. Preston was escorted out by federal investigators shortly after Vanessa handed over the complete evidence file, and Russell was taken into custody soon after for his role supporting the broader network. Before he was led away, Preston turned back one last time toward Grant. "You think this makes you North Star again?" he asked bitterly. "No," Grant answered. He looked at Wade, then at Vanessa. "It reminds me I never actually needed the name at all." After Preston was gone, Grant stood alone at the glass windows of the 61st floor, watching the city spread out beneath him in the gray Chicago light. Vanessa joined him quietly. "What happens now?" she asked. "I go back to work," he said. She laughed, certain he was joking. He wasn't. "The heating system on the 12th floor is still broken," he told her. And for the first time, in what felt like days, Vanessa laughed with genuine, unguarded relief. But the following morning, when Grant returned to the hotel's maintenance office, he found his old, battered toolbox gone, entirely replaced by something else sitting on the workbench instead. In its place sat a new toolbox, sleek and black, and when Grant opened it, he found no hidden technology, no weapons, nothing but a set of high-quality professional maintenance tools. Resting on top was a small card, bearing a short, handwritten message. "For things people ignore." Grant recognized his own words. Immediately, the very phrase he'd once used on Preston in that first tense exchange at the board meeting. Vanessa appeared in the doorway a moment later. "How did you get in here?" he asked. "I bought the hotel," she answered simply. Grant looked at her, waiting for the explanation, and she admitted that Whitmore Meridian's acquisition of the Halston Crown had actually been negotiated months earlier, though she'd quietly pushed to finalize the deal far faster than originally planned. Grant raised an eyebrow. "So you're my boss now," he said. "Technically," she replied. "I quit," he said flatly. "Technically, your contract requires 2 weeks' notice," she answered. And for a brief moment, the tension between them dissolved into something lighter. Almost easy. Then her tone shifted, growing more serious. She wasn't offering him a position as her bodyguard, and she wasn't asking him to return to the world he'd spent 11 years trying to escape. Instead, she had created an entirely new independent division inside Whitmore Meridian, one dedicated specifically to identifying the risks leadership consistently failed to see on their own. Grant asked what title the role carried. "You choose," she told him. He looked down at the new toolbox sitting between them. "Maintenance," he said, and Vanessa laughed again, agreeing without hesitation on one condition of his own. Nobody was ever to call him North Star again. She agreed. In the weeks that followed, Whitmore Meridian underwent a quiet, thorough restructuring. Every compromised contract Preston had built was frozen and unwound, and thousands of employees were protected from a financial collapse that had nearly reached them without their knowledge. Wade and the 5 other men never reassembled as any kind of formal team again. They met only once more in a small diner far from the glass towers downtown, no missions left to plan, no code names left to use. Wade lifted his coffee cup in a simple toast. "To Grant," he said. The 5 others repeated it in unison. "To Grant." Not one of them said the word North Star. Grant simply smiled and let the moment pass without correction. In the final scene, Grant and Vanessa stood together inside an elevator at Whitmore Meridian headquarters when a senior executive stepped in beside them. The man glanced at Grant's simple work clothes with faint curiosity. "Maintenance?" he asked. "Yes," Grant answered. The executive pointed up toward a flickering overhead light. "Think you can fix that?" he asked. Grant looked up at the light, then glanced sideways at Vanessa, who was clearly fighting back a smile of her own. Grant let out a slow breath. "I fix things people ignore," he said. And the elevator doors slid shut behind them. For 11 years, Grant believed a scar marked the night he failed. But scars don't always remember failure. Sometimes they remember the moment a man had every reason to run and chose to turn back instead. And Vanessa finally understood why 6 men had lowered their heads when they heard his old name. They weren't afraid of North Star. They were standing in front of the man who once came back for every single one of them,